August 5, 1942, 10:30 in the morning. Charters Towers Airfield, Queensland, Australia. Major General George Kenny stood under the wing of a Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber, watching a middle-aged captain in grease-stained coveralls install machine guns into an aircraft nose in a way that violated every Army Air Force regulation he could think of. The captain was Paul Irving Gunn, 42 years old, former Navy Chief Petty Officer, currently assigned to the 3rd Attack Group. Everyone called him Pappy. The Japanese controlled most of the Southwest Pacific. American forces were barely holding on in New Guinea. Standard bombing tactics were not working. High-altitude bombing missed moving ships. Medium-altitude attacks gave ships time to evade. American aircraft were getting shot down trying to get close enough to hit anything. Kenny had arrived in Australia 3 days earlier to take command of the 5th Air Force. He inherited a disaster. 75 operational fighters for the entire theatre. Hundreds of wrecked aircraft piled up for salvage. Demoralized pilots. Failed tactics. And now he was watching a captain modify an attack bomber without authorization, without engineering approval, without permission from anyone. Gunn was installing 4 .50 caliber machine guns into the nose of the A-20, where the bombardier usually sat a day. The guns came from wrecked P-40 fighters that would never fly again. Gunn had scavenged them himself from a pile of 170 wrecked aircraft sitting at the Brisbane salvage yard. He explained his reasoning to Kenny. If bombers attacked at low altitude and high speed, the bombardier could not aim anyway. The pilot would release bombs and fire guns simultaneously. Maximum firepower delivered at minimum altitude. Skip the bombs into the side of ships. Strafe the decks to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Hit them before they could shoot back. Kenny listened carefully. He understood attack aviation better than most generals. He had taught the subject at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, when most officers dismissed it as secondary to strategic bombing. He had written the developmental requirements for attack aircraft. He had written course material on low-level tactics. He had experimented with skip bombing against ground targets, and even played with parachute fragmentation bombs. He was one of the few senior officers in the Army Air Force who believed attack aviation could win wars. But nobody had tried combining all these elements, attacking ships at wave-top height with modified bombers carrying overwhelming nose-mounted firepower. The concept was revolutionary. If it worked, it would change naval warfare in the Pacific. Ships would be vulnerable to air attack in ways they had never been before. The Japanese would lose their ability to reinforce positions by sea. The entire strategic picture would shift. The idea was also completely unauthorized. Army Air Force regulations required engineering approval for any modification to aircraft systems. That approval came from Wright Field in Ohio, 7,000 miles away. The engineering staff at Wright Field tested everything, analyzed stress loads, calculated weight and balance, verified structural integrity. The approval process took months, sometimes years. Kenny did not have months. He barely had weeks. The Japanese were winning. American forces were retreating. Innovation could not wait for bureaucracy. Gunn had already lost everything to the Japanese. His wife, Clara, and their 4 children, Nathaniel, Paul Jr., Connie, and Julie, were imprisoned at the University of Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Gunn had been living in the Philippines before the war, running Philippine Airlines, flying Beechcraft Model 18s between Manila and other cities. When the Japanese invaded in December 1941, Gunn flew reconnaissance missions, evacuated civilians, delivered supplies to besieged American forces on Bataan. On April 18, 1942, Gunn flew one of the most dangerous missions of his life. He piloted an unarmed transport aircraft into Japanese-controlled airspace to deliver medical supplies to American troops trapped on Bataan. Japanese fighters intercepted him. Gunn flew at treetop level through the jungle, dodging enemy aircraft, taking ground fire, getting the supplies through. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission. But when American forces surrendered, Gunn had to evacuate to Australia. He tried to get his family out first. He could not. The Japanese had already taken control of Manila. His wife and children were captured and sent to the internment camp. Gunn escaped, but his family stayed behind. He had not seen them since. He did not know if they were alive. He had been fighting the Japanese ever since, not through regular channels, not through normal procedures, but through whatever methods killed the enemy most effectively. The first pilot Kenny lost to inadequate firepower was Captain William Benn. Benn was a B-17 pilot with the 63rd Bomb Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group. Brilliant pilot, natural innovator, exactly the kind of officer Kenny needed. In October 1942, Benn developed skip bombing tactics for B-17s attacking Japanese ships. Fly low, 250 feet above the water, 200 miles per hour. Release bombs so they skipped across the surface like stones on a pond. The bombs would hit the ship at the waterline where armor was weakest. Benn flew the first successful skip bombing attack on October 23, 1942. He hit a Japanese cargo ship and watched it sink. The tactic worked. But B-17s were heavy bombers, designed for high-altitude strategic bombing. They were not ideal for low-level attack. They lacked forward-firing armament. They could not suppress defensive fire while approaching the target. The crew had to endure anti-aircraft fire for the entire attack run with no way to fight back. Benn knew the limitation. He worked on it constantly, experimenting with different approach angles, different release points, trying to find ways to reduce exposure time. On January 18, 1943, Benn led an attack on Japanese positions near Leh. His B-17 was hit by anti-aircraft fire during the approach. The aircraft crashed. Benn and his entire crew were killed. Kenny read the casualty report. Benn had done everything right. He had followed correct procedures. He had executed the attack perfectly. The bomber simply could not suppress enemy fire. The Japanese shot it down before it could release its payload. That was the problem. American doctrine said bombers should fly high and rely on fighter escorts for protection. But Kenny did not have enough fighters. He needed bombers that could protect themselves. The problem was clear. American bombers lacked the forward firepower to suppress enemy defenses during low-level attacks. High-altitude bombing allowed bombers to stay above most anti-aircraft fire, but accuracy was poor, and ships could maneuver to avoid bombs. Medium-altitude bombing put aircraft in the worst possible position, low enough for accurate anti-aircraft fire, but high enough that aiming was still difficult. Low-altitude attack was the only solution, but it required overwhelming forward firepower to suppress defenses before the bomber came into range of enemy guns. The 3rd Attack Group commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Davies, sent a report to headquarters. His pilots were dying because they could not suppress enemy fire. The 30 caliber guns were worthless against armored targets. He needed 50 caliber guns, heavy machine guns that could penetrate armor, destroy gun positions, kill crews. Headquarters said modifications required engineering approval. Engineering approval required 6 months. Davies did not have 6 months. His pilots were dying now. That was when Davies told Pappy Gunn to do whatever was necessary. Officially, Davies could not authorize unauthorized modifications. Unofficially, he could look the other way while his maintenance officer installed scavenged guns from wrecked fighters into aircraft that were supposed to be in maintenance. Gunn understood. He had been a Navy enlisted pilot for 20 years. He knew how to work around regulations when lives were at stake. By August 1942, Gunn had modified 6 A-20s with 4 50 caliber machine guns each. The installation was crude. Sheet metal patches covered blast areas. Ammunition boxes were welded into the nose compartment. Feed systems were jury-rigged from spare parts. Nothing was standardized. Nothing was approved. Everything worked. The modified A-20s flew their first combat mission on August 31, 1942, a coordinated raid with B-26, marauders against the Japanese airfield at Leh, New Guinea. 16 A-20s participated, 6 of them with nose gun modifications. Lieutenant Colonel John Davies led the formation. They flew across the Owen Stanley Mountains at low altitude, following valleys, staying under Japanese radar coverage. The attack began at dawn. The modified A-20s came in at 500 feet altitude, 250 miles per hour airspeed. The Japanese were not expecting low-level attack. Their fighters were parked on the runway. Their anti-aircraft guns were positioned for high-altitude defense. When the A-20s opened fire with their 50-caliber nose guns, the effect was catastrophic. The heavy machine guns destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could take off. They killed crews running to their fighters. They shredded the control tower. They destroyed fuel trucks. The bombs that followed ignited fires across the airfield. Secondary explosions from ammunition stores and fuel dumps continued for hours after the attack ended. All 16 A-20s returned to base. One had minor damage from ground fire, no casualties. Davies filed his after-action report the same day. The nose gun modification was a complete success. Forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns suppressed defensive fire so effectively that the bombers could attack at minimum altitude with minimal risk. The tactic should be expanded to all A-20s in theater as soon as possible. He recommended that Captain Gunn be promoted and given authority to modify additional aircraft. Kenny read the report and made his decision immediately. He promoted Gunn to Major. He assigned him to 5th Air Force Headquarters as Special Projects Officer. He gave him a team of mechanics and armorers. He ordered him to modify every A-20 in the Southwest Pacific Theater and to scavenge whatever parts were necessary from the wreck pile. Gunn went to work. Over the next 2 months, Gunn modified 32 A-20 aircraft. He also solved a critical range problem. The standard A-20 had a combat radius of 260 miles with a full bomb load. That was not enough to reach Japanese bases on the north coast of New Guinea. Gunn installed auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay, reducing bomb capacity but extending range to 400 miles. The modification required custom-fabricated tanks, modified fuel systems, and careful weight and balance calculations. Gunn did it all without engineering drawings or official approval, but the A-20 still had limitations. It was a light bomber designed for tactical support, not strategic attack. It could carry only 2,000 pounds of bombs. Its range, even with auxiliary tanks, was barely adequate. Kenny needed something bigger, something that could reach every Japanese base in New Guinea and the Bismarck archipelago, something that could carry enough firepower to destroy shipping and devastate installations. He needed the B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was a medium bomber, twin-engine, crew of 6, designed for medium-altitude bombing. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs, had a range of 1,500 miles, and was fast enough to outrun most Japanese fighters. But it had the same problem as every other American bomber: inadequate forward armament, just 2 50-caliber guns in the nose, fired by the bombardier, not enough to suppress enemy defenses. Kenny called Gunn into his office in November 1942. He wanted 12 B-25s modified as strafer bombers. Remove the bombardier, remove the bomb sight, fill the nose with as many 50-caliber guns as physically possible. Add external fuel tanks to increase range. Turn the medium bomber into a commerce destroyer that could sink ships, destroy airfields, and eliminate Japanese positions at low altitude with overwhelming firepower. Gunn said it would work, but there would be serious engineering challenges. Adding 4 or more guns to the nose would shift the center of gravity forward by at least 12 inches. The aircraft would be nose-heavy. Handling characteristics would change dramatically. Takeoff would require higher speeds and more runway. Landing would be critical because the nose would want to drop. Pilots would need retraining. There were also structural concerns. 8 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously would produce tremendous recoil forces. The airframe was not designed for that kind of stress. Rivets might pop, panels might buckle, structural members might crack. The modifications would have to include significant reinforcement, adding weight, which would further affect performance. The ammunition load would also be a challenge. 8 guns with 500 rounds each meant 4,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition. Each round weighed approximately 4 ounces. 4,000 rounds weighed 1,000 pounds. That weight had to go in the nose, making the center of gravity problem even worse. Fuel would have to be moved aft, equipment would have to be repositioned, the entire aircraft would have to be rebalanced. And there was one more problem. Regulations. The B-25 was built by North American Aviation under contract to the Army Air Force. Any modification to the basic design required approval from both the manufacturer and the Army Air Force Engineering Command. That approval process could take a year or more. Gunn would be modifying aircraft without manufacturer approval, without engineering approval, without documentation, using parts scavenged from other aircraft. If anything went wrong, if a modified aircraft crashed due to structural failure or handling problems, Gunn would face a court-martial. Kenny might face relief from command. Kenny told Gunn to solve the problems and ignore the regulations. They were at war. American pilots were dying because they could not suppress enemy fire. If Gunn's modifications saved lives and killed Japanese, that was all that mattered. Official approval could come later. Results came first. Gunn went to work. He selected B-25 aircraft number 41-12946 for the first conversion. The aircraft had just arrived from the United States and had not yet been assigned to a combat squadron. It was nicknamed Margaret, name painted on the nose by the factory workers who built it. Gunn and his team took Margaret to the modification center at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane. The work took 3 weeks of 16-hour days. They removed the entire bombardier compartment from the nose. The plexiglass panels came out. The bomb sight came out. The navigator and bombardier positions were eliminated. In their place, Gunn installed a solid nose fairing with 4 50 caliber machine guns mounted in a tight pattern. The guns were M2 Brownings, the same model used in fighters, belt-fed, with a cyclic rate of 850 rounds per minute. Gun mounts were fabricated from steel plate. Ammunition boxes were welded into position. Feed chutes routed the belts from the boxes to the guns. Blast tubes protected the fuselage from muzzle blast. Spent cartridge cases and belt links were ejected through chutes in the bottom of the nose. The entire system was controlled by a single trigger button on the pilot's control column. When he pressed the button, all 4 guns fired simultaneously. But 4 guns were not enough. Kenny wanted more firepower. Gunn added 2 more guns in blisters on each side of the forward fuselage, just aft of the nose. These guns were fixed in position, aimed slightly inward so their fire converged with the nose guns at approximately 1,000 yards. Sheet metal fairings covered the gun barrels to reduce drag. Large blast deflector plates protected the fuselage skin from the muzzle blast and ejected gases. 6 guns total, but Gunn was not finished. He added 2 more guns, 1 on each side of the fuselage just forward of the cockpit, 8 50 caliber machine guns, all firing forward, all controlled by the pilot. The firepower was staggering. At maximum rate of fire, the 8 guns could put out 6,800 rounds per minute. That was 113 rounds per second. The weight of fire was enough to destroy any ship, any aircraft, any ground installation. Gun test flew Margaret on December 23, 1942. The aircraft was nose-heavy, exactly as predicted. It wanted to pitch down during takeoff. He had to hold back pressure on the control column to keep the nose up. Once airborne, the handling was acceptable but not ideal. The center of gravity was too far forward. He flew to the gunnery range and fired the guns. All 8 50 calibers opened up simultaneously. The recoil was tremendous. The aircraft shuddered. Rivets popped out of the fuselage skin, panels buckled from the vibration, but the guns worked. 8 streams of 50 caliber bullets converged on the target. The firepower was incredible. Gunn landed and reported to Kenny. The modification worked, but needed refinement. Gunn and his team spent January 1943 solving the problems. They moved the fuselage guns further aft to help the center of gravity. They added lead ballast to the tail. They reinforced rivets and structural panels. They removed the lower turret to save weight. They removed the tail guns. Those positions were useless in a low-level attack. The weight savings helped balance the aircraft. By February 1, 1943, 12 B-25 strafers were complete. They were assigned to the 90th Bomb Squadron, 3rd Bomb Group. The squadron commander was Major Edward Larner, 31 years old, experienced bomber pilot, aggressive leader. He had been flying B-25s since arriving in theatre. He knew the aircraft inside and out. When he saw what gun had done, he understood immediately. This was the weapon they needed. Larner spent February training his pilots on the strafer tactics. Low-level approach, 250 feet above the water. High speed, over 250 miles per hour. Guns open fire at 1,000 yards. Suppress all visible defenses. Release bombs at 300 yards using skip bombing technique. Pull up and climb away before the explosions. The entire attack run lasted less than 30 seconds per aircraft. The pilots practiced constantly. They flew practice runs against wrecked ships offshore. They learned to judge altitude without instruments. They learned to time their bomb releases. They learned to fire the nose guns in controlled bursts to avoid overheating. Most importantly, they learned to trust the aircraft. The strafer B-25 looked ungainly on the ground but flew like a fighter in combat. What none of them knew was that Wright Field Engineering Command had received reports about the unauthorized modifications. Engineers at Wright Field analyzed the specifications. They calculated weight and balance. They evaluated structural loads. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The modifications were dangerous. The aircraft would be uncontrollable. The structural loads would cause catastrophic failure. They sent a message to Kenny. Ground all modified B-25s, immediately pending engineering review. Kenny received the message on February 26, 1943. He read it, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. His bombers were about to prove the engineers wrong. Intelligence had detected a large Japanese convoy preparing to depart Rabaul. The convoy would carry 6,900 troops to reinforce Japanese positions at Lae, New Guinea. If those troops reached Lae, the Allies would face a much stronger enemy. If the convoy could be destroyed, it would be a devastating blow to Japanese operations. Kenny called his operations officer, Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead. He told him to prepare every available aircraft for a maximum effort attack. B-17s for medium-altitude bombing, bow fighters for low-level strafing, A-20s for skip bombing, and the strafer B-25s for the killing blow. This would be their first combat test. Everything depended on Larner's squadron. The Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor in Rabaul on the night of February 28, 1943. 8 transport ships carrying the troops and supplies, 8 destroyers as escorts, approximately 100 fighter aircraft providing air cover. It was the largest convoy the Japanese had sent to New Guinea in months. They were confident. Their intelligence said the Allies lacked the capability to stop them. Allied intelligence was better. Radio intercepts decoded by codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington revealed the convoy's destination and schedule. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy on March 1st. It was heading south through the Bismarck Sea, making 12 knots, scheduled to arrive at Lae on March 4th. Kenny had 3 days to destroy it. The attack began on the afternoon of March 2nd. 8 B-17s found the convoy and attacked from 15,000 feet. They claimed 2 hits. 1 transport appeared to be damaged. The convoy continued. The Japanese were not worried. High-altitude bombing rarely worked against maneuvering ships. They pressed on toward Lae. That night, reconnaissance aircraft tracked the convoy. The ships maintained their course and speed. By dawn on March 3rd, they would be within range of every Allied aircraft in theatre. Kenny ordered the attack for first light. Everything would hit them at once. The Japanese would not know what was happening until it was too late. March 3rd, 1943, 06:15 hours. 90 Allied aircraft took off from bases across New Guinea. B-17s, A-20s, bow fighters, and the strafer B-25s, P. 38 fighters flew top cover. The formation assembled over Cape Ward Hunt and headed northwest toward the Japanese convoy. At 09:45, the lead aircraft spotted the convoy. 16 ships in a tight defensive formation, destroyers on the perimeter, transports in the center, Japanese fighters circled overhead. The convoy was making maximum speed toward Leh, still 120 miles away. If they could reach the coast, they could unload under the protection of land-based anti-aircraft guns. Kenny could not let that happen. The first wave was B-17s attacking from medium altitude. The Japanese fighters rose to meet them. P-38s engaged the fighters. The B-17s released their bombs from 8,000 feet. Most missed. A few hit near the transports. One transport appeared to be on fire. The convoy continued. The second wave was Beaufighters, 13 aircraft, Royal Australian Air Force, flown by pilots who had been training for exactly this mission. They came in at 50 feet above the water, flying just above the waves, too low for the Japanese to track them effectively. The Beaufighters were armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns. They opened fire at 500 yards. The effect was catastrophic for the Japanese. The cannons tore through the superstructures of the destroyers. They killed officers on the bridge. They destroyed fire control systems. They shredded anti-aircraft gun crews. The destroyers tried to return fire but could not depress their guns low enough to hit aircraft flying at wave-top height. The Beaufighters made 2 passes and climbed away. They had done their job. The convoy's defenses were suppressed. Now came Lana's B-25s. 12 aircraft in 4 flights of 3. Lana led the first flight. They approached from the east with the morning sun behind them. Altitude 250 feet, speed 260 miles per hour. The Japanese spotted them too. Late. The Strafer B-25s were smaller and faster than B-17s. They looked like fighters until they were close enough to attack. At 1,000 yards, Lana opened fire. 8 50 caliber machine guns hammered. The sound was deafening even inside the pressurized cockpit. Tracers reached out toward the nearest transport ship, a 6,000-ton cargo vessel loaded with troops and supplies. The other 2 B-25s in his flight opened fire simultaneously. 24 machine guns firing at one ship. The combined firepower was devastating beyond anything the Japanese had experienced. The 50 caliber rounds tore through the transport's superstructure like it was made of paper. Bridge windows exploded in showers of glass. The wheelhouse disintegrated. Gun crews died at their stations, cut down before they could return fire. Communications equipment was destroyed. Fire control systems were shredded. The transport lost steering control within the first 3 seconds of the attack. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns tried to respond. Gunners swung their weapons toward the attacking bombers, but the B-25s were too low and too fast. The guns could not depress far enough to track targets at 250 feet altitude. The few shots that were fired went high, missing completely. And then the gunners were dead, killed by the concentrated machine gun fire from 3 Strafer bombers attacking in formation. At 300 yards, Lana released his bombs. 2 500-pound bombs with 4-second delayed fuses. He pulled back on the control column and climbed away, banking hard left to clear the target area. Behind him, the bombs fell away from the aircraft, tumbled briefly, then stabilized and skipped across the water surface like flat stones on a pond. The technique was called skip bombing, and it had been perfected by Major William Benn months earlier, using B-17 bombers. The bombs hit the water approximately 100 yards from the target ship. They bounced once, twice, then struck the hull at the waterline, traveling at over 200 miles per hour. The momentum carried them through the thin hull plating. The delayed fuses meant the bombs penetrated deep inside the ship before detonating. When they exploded, the blast occurred inside the hull, in the cargo holds and troop compartments. The transport broke in half. The explosion blew out the bottom of the ship. Water rushed in. The forward section listed to starboard and started to sink. The aft section rolled to port. Troops trapped below decks had no chance. The ship went down in less than 3 minutes. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were dragged under. Total time from opening fire to climbing away was 18 seconds. The transport was doomed. Lana's wingmen attacked 2 more transports in the same formation. Captain Robert Strickland hit the second transport with the same devastating effect. His bombs penetrated the engine room. The explosion destroyed the boilers. Steam filled the compartments, killing everyone inside. The ship lost all power and started taking on water. Lieutenant Donald Mitchell attacked the third transport. His machine gun fire killed the bridge crew and destroyed the steering. His bombs hit amidships, blowing a hole in the hull 20 feet across. The transport began settling by the stern. Lifeboats launched. Troops jumped into the water. The organized convoy was dissolving into chaos and 3 transports were sinking, and the attack was not over. The second flight of B-25s attacked the destroyers. Major John Hennebrey led this element. Destroyers were more dangerous than transports. They had heavier anti-aircraft armament, better fire control, more experienced crews, but they were also more lightly built. Their hulls were thinner. Their structures were more vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. Hennebrey approached the lead destroyer at an angle, coming in from the starboard quarter where most of the anti-aircraft guns could not bear. His strafer B-25 opened fire at 1,000 yards. The 850 caliber guns concentrated on the destroyer's superstructure. They destroyed the bridge, killed the officers, wrecked the fire control equipment. The destroyer lost command and control in seconds. The bombs that followed were perfectly aimed. They skipped into the destroyer's side amidships, penetrated the thin hull, and exploded in the engineering spaces. The destroyer lost power. Dead in the water, burning, the crew abandoned ship. Another destroyer, trying to maneuver to avoid the attacking aircraft, collided with a damaged transport. The collision tore open both ships' hulls. Both vessels were lost. The third and fourth flights attacked the remaining transports. The pattern was the same. Low-altitude approach at high speed. Devastating machine gun fire suppressing all defenses. Skip bombing with delayed fuse bombs penetrating deep into the hulls before exploding. One after another, the Japanese transports were destroyed. By the time the last B-25 pulled away, the organized convoy had become a debris field of burning, sinking, exploding ships. The entire first attack wave, from when the Beaufighters opened fire at 09:53 to when the last B-25 pulled away at 10:07, lasted 14 minutes. In that time, the Allies sank or mortally damaged 12 ships. The Japanese lost 3 transports and 2 destroyers outright in those first 14 minutes. 4 more transports were burning and would sink within hours. 2 more destroyers were severely damaged and limping back toward Rabaul. The remaining ships scattered, trying to reach the coast before the next attack wave arrived. Lana reformed his squadron and flew back to base. They landed at Port Moresby at 11:30. The ground crews were waiting. They counted the aircraft. All 12 strafers returned. Minor damage on 3 aircraft. No casualties. Lana climbed out of his cockpit and walked to the operations tent. He reported to Whitehead. The attack worked exactly as planned. The strafer B-25s performed perfectly. What Lana and Kenny did not know was that Japanese submarine I-26 was in the area, rescuing survivors. The submarine captain filed a report describing the attack. He called it the most devastating aerial assault he had ever witnessed. American bombers attacking at wave top height with overwhelming firepower. Ships had no chance to defend themselves. The attack was over before crews could organize effective resistance. Entire transports were destroyed in seconds. The submarine captain recommended that future convoys avoid daylight movement in range of American aircraft. The risk was too great. Follow-up attacks continued on March 4th. A-20s and Beaufighters attacked survivors in the water and rescue ships trying to pick them up. This was controversial then, and remains controversial now. The attacking pilots and commanders defended the decision. Any Japanese soldier who reached shore would join enemy forces. The battle was not over until the enemy could no longer fight. The attacks continued. PT boats from the US Navy joined the cleanup operations. They found scattered groups of survivors and engaged them. A few hundred Japanese soldiers reached the coast and eventually made it to Leh. Most did not. Of the 6,900 troops that left Rabaul, approximately 1,200 reached Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul. The rest, approximately 3,000 men, were killed. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, 2 destroyers damaged, multiple aircraft shot down, 3,000 soldiers and sailors dead. The convoy was annihilated. Japan never again attempted to send a large convoy through waters controlled by Allied aircraft. American losses were minimal: 13 aircrew killed, 12 wounded. 3 P-38s and 1 B-17 shot down in combat. 1 B-25 and 1 Beaufighter crashed in accidents. For the Allies, it was a stunning victory. For the Japanese, it was a disaster that fundamentally changed their strategy in the Southwest Pacific. But none of that would have been possible without Pappy Gunn's unauthorized modifications. The Strafer B-25s were the decisive weapon. They delivered the killing blows that sank the convoy. Without them, the attack would have been less effective. Ships would have escaped. Troops would have reached Leh. The battle would have been different. Major General Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, was in Washington when reports of the Battle of Bismarck Sea arrived. He read them with interest. The results were impressive. But he had questions about the modified B-25s. His engineering staff at Wright Field had filed reports saying those modifications were dangerous and unauthorized. Now those same aircraft had just won a major victory. Arnold wanted answers. He called Kenny to Washington for a conference in late March 1943. Kenny flew back to the United States, bringing complete data on the Strafer modifications. He met with Arnold and a team of engineers from Wright Field. The engineers presented their analysis. The modifications violated multiple regulations. The center of gravity was outside acceptable limits. The structural loads exceeded design specifications. The aircraft should be grounded immediately. Kenny listened to them present their case for 20 minutes. Then he told them that the modified B-25s had just helped sink 8 transports and 4 destroyers in the most decisive air victory of the Pacific War. 12 Strafer B-25s attacked at minimum altitude against heavy defenses. All 12 returned safely. The modifications worked. The pilots loved them. The results spoke for themselves. The engineers argued that the modifications were still outside specifications. Kenny replied that he did not care about specifications. He cared about winning the war. His pilots were killing Japanese with those modifications. If Wright Field wanted to help, they could figure out how to make the modifications official and incorporate them into production aircraft. If they did not want to help, they could get out of his way. Arnold sided with Kenny. The results were undeniable. He directed North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25, to work with Gunn to incorporate the Strafer modifications into production. He ordered Wright Field to provide engineering support instead of obstacles. The modifications would become official. Gunn traveled to North American Aviation's plant in California in April 1943. He worked with the engineering team for 3 weeks, explaining how the field modifications were done. The North, American engineers were impressed. They refined Gunn's design, adding 6 50 caliber guns instead of 4 in the nose, improving the structural reinforcement, standardizing the installation. By June 1943, North American was producing B-25 Strafers directly from the factory. The factory-produced Strafers became the B-25G and later the B-25H. The G model added a 75mm cannon in the nose in addition to machine guns. The H model had 1450 caliber machine guns plus the cannon. The final variant, the B-25J, could be configured as either a Strafer with 18 machine guns or a standard bomber with a glazed nose. Nearly 10,000 B-25s were built during the war. Thousands were Strafers based on Gunn's original design. The Strafer B-25s continued to devastate Japanese forces throughout the Pacific War. They destroyed shipping, obliterated airfields, annihilated ground positions. At Wewak in August 1943, Strafer B-25s destroyed 174 Japanese aircraft on the ground in a single raid. At Hollandia in March 1944, They destroyed 400 aircraft. The Japanese never recovered air superiority in New Guinea. But the official records do not mention Pappy Gun by name. North American Aviation's documentation credits the strafer design to company engineers. Army Air Force reports attribute the modifications to 5th Air Force innovation. Gun's name appears in maintenance logs and field reports, but not in the official histories. He received no medal for the modification, no commendation, no recognition beyond the pilots and mechanics who knew what he had done. Edward Larner did not survive the war. On April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months after leading the attack at Bismarck Sea, Larner was landing at Dobodura Airfield after a mission. He executed his trademark maneuver, diving toward the runway, pulling low over the field, then pulling up sharply into a climbing turn. But this time his aircraft was heavily loaded with fuel, passengers, cargo, and ammunition. When he pulled up, the aircraft stalled, went into a flat spin, and crashed. Larner and everyone aboard were killed. He left behind a wife and 2 daughters. He was 31 years old. Captain John Hennebrey took command of the 90th Squadron. Hennebrey continued Larner's aggressive tactics and became one of the most successful strafer pilots in the Pacific. He flew dozens of missions, destroyed numerous Japanese targets, and trained new pilots in the techniques Larner had developed. The 90th Squadron became known as the Jolly Rogers and maintained the highest kill ratio of any B-25 unit in theater. George Kenney remained commander of Far East Air Forces until the end of the war. He led the air campaign through New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually to Japan. He pioneered airlift, operations, paratrooper assaults, and coordinated air-ground operations. After the war, he wrote 3 books about the Pacific Air Campaign. One of them was titled The Saga of Pappy Gun, published in 1959. It was a tribute to the man Kenney called one of aviation's great pioneers. Pappy Gun survived the war, barely. He flew hundreds of combat missions, was wounded 9 times, earned 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, a Silver Star, a Legion of Merit, an Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and later to Colonel. When the Philippines were liberated in 1945, he was reunited with his family. His wife and children had survived 3 years of internment at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. They were emaciated and traumatized, but alive. Gunn retired from the Army Air Force in June 1948 due to physical disability from his wounds. He returned to the Philippines and restarted Philippine Airlines, the company he had founded before the war. He flew charter flights across the Pacific, rebuilt the airline industry, and lived quietly. He never sought recognition for his wartime innovations. When people asked, he said he was just a mechanic who fixed airplanes. That was all. On October 11th, 1957, Gunn was flying a charter flight in a Beechcraft Model 18 over the Philippines. A storm moved in faster than forecast. The aircraft encountered severe turbulence and heavy rain. Gunn tried to climb above the weather, but could not gain altitude quickly enough. The aircraft crashed into a mountainside. Gunn and all passengers aboard were killed. He was 57 years old. Paul Irving Gunn is buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida. His grave marker lists his rank as Colonel, United States Army Air Force. Dates of birth October 18, 1899. Date of death October 11, 1957. The marker notes his service in World War II. It does not mention that he changed how American bombers fought in the Pacific. It does not mention the strafer modifications that killed thousands of Japanese and saved hundreds of American lives. It does not mention the Battle of Bismarck Sea. It does not mention that his unauthorized innovations, done without permission, without approval, without recognition, fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Southwest Pacific. Philippine Airlines still exists. The company Gunn, founded in 1941, continues to operate today, more than 80 years later. It is one of the oldest commercial airlines in Asia, one of the few that survived World War II and continued into the modern era. The company operates flights across the Pacific, throughout Southeast Asia, connecting the Philippines to the world. Very few passengers who fly on Philippine Airlines know that the founder was an American colonel who spent 3 years fighting a personal war against the Japanese who imprisoned his family. Very few know that before he built an airline, he built strafer bombers that changed naval warfare. The B-25 strafer concept spread beyond the 5th Air Force. By late 1943, strafer conversions were standard across the Pacific theater. The 7th Air Force in the Central Pacific used them. The 13th Air Force in the Solomon Islands used them. Marine Corps PBJ squadrons, Flying Navy designated B-25s, used strafer configurations for ground attack missions. The concept even spread to Europe, where the 12th Air Force modified B-25s for ground attack missions in Italy and southern France, though the European modifications were less extensive than the Pacific versions. North American aviation built thousands of factory-produced strafer B-25s based on guns' original field modifications. The B-25G introduced a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose, the largest caliber gun ever mounted in an American bomber. The installation was complex, requiring significant structural reinforcement. The cannon could destroy ships with a single hit, but it had a slow rate of fire and terrifying recoil. Crews called it both effective and terrifying to use. The B-25H refined the concept with 14 forward firing 50 caliber machine guns plus the 75mm cannon. Some versions carried additional guns in the tail and waist positions. The H model could put out an incredible volume of fire. At maximum rate, all 14 machine guns firing simultaneously produced over 10,000 rounds per minute. The firepower was so intense that pilots had to fire in controlled bursts to avoid overheating the barrels and exhausting ammunition too quickly. The final production variant, the B-25J, could be configured either way. The glass-nose version served as a conventional medium bomber with a bombardier. The solid-nose version carried up to 1850 caliber machine guns for strafing missions. Nearly 5,000 J models were built, split between both configurations. The versatility made the B-25 the most successful medium bomber of World War II. Total B-25 production exceeded 9,800 aircraft. The type served in every theater of the war, flew more combat missions than any other American twin-engine bomber, destroyed more enemy targets, and had a lower loss rate than comparable aircraft. The strafer versions, descended directly from guns' unauthorized modifications, accounted for thousands of enemy ships, aircraft, vehicles, and installations destroyed. The impact on the Pacific War was immeasurable. In military museums across the United States, there are B-25 strafers on display. Many of them have placards describing the aircraft's role in the Pacific War. Most mention the Battle of Bismarck Sea. Some mention skip bombing and low-level attack tactics. Very few mention Pappy Gunn. His name has been largely forgotten outside of aviation history circles and World War II researchers. That is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees or headquarters staff meetings. Through mechanics and pilots who see problems and solve them without waiting for permission. Through captains who scavenge parts from wrecked aircraft and install them in ways the manual says are impossible. Through commanders who ignore regulations when lives are at stake. Through men who fight their own personal wars against an enemy that took everything from them. The Battle of Bismarck Sea was the turning point in the New Guinea campaign. It proved that Allied air power could stop Japanese reinforcement convoys. It demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated low-level attack. It validated innovations that had been developed in the field by men who did not wait for headquarters approval. The battle lasted 3 days. But the decisive attack lasted 14 minutes. In those 14 minutes, 12 modified bombers destroyed a convoy and changed the course of the Pacific War. And it all started with a middle-aged captain in greasy coveralls, installing scavenged machine guns into a bomber nose, telling a general that the only way to win was to break the rules and hit the enemy harder than they could hit back. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.